right, you're listening to NYC Radio Live. David Ellenbogen here, live from Mumbai, Bombay. You might hear the occasional car horn in the background. And I'm at the lovely home of Namita Devidayal. And she is well known as the author of The Music Room. And she's just coming out with a new book called The Sixth String of Vilayat Khan. How are you doing? Thank you for such a lovely book.
Hi, it's great to be on air in New York, my old hometown.
Yeah, good to be with you. As I was telling you, I've been here. I think I arrived in Bombay on Saturday or something like that, and I finished this book, and it's I don't know, Wednesday now. So I tore through this book. It's a great read.
Shall I quiz you?
Yeah, you can.
So, what did Vilayat Khan do when he was 13 and a half? Like, which part of the world was he in? I'm just kidding.
Good. Well, one thing I love about the book, actually, is, and it set me at ease, is right off the bat, you say that India is not a place that truth is given an undue import.
Well, yeah. So to respond to that, I think truth is a very interesting word, right? It's like love. I mean, it just has so many facets to it. It's not a singular thing ever, and so that's at a very sort of philosophical level. But more realistically, in India, there is very little archived information available on any of these old historic icons. So you really have to rely on a lot of anecdotal information, and so when you do that, you find that for every version of the story, there's another version, or maybe several. And so you sort of have to start learning how to discern through the stories and find the quote-unquote truth in that. And it takes a little bit of, subtle understanding, and sort of you learn to read between the lines, you learn to listen to what people don't have to say about the artist. You talk to as many people, and even the seemingly irrelevant ones. Like, in the process of doing this, I went and met literally people from his doggy vet to his ex-lovers to his family, of course, and students and fans. But you kind of have to really create this picture based on whatever you can get, and all those different versions add up to the truth. But you're not relying on dates and historic facts only. It's kind of something much more layered. And
I imagine, being immersed in the world of Vilayat Khan. I mean, this man is paradoxical in many different ways. Did you?
Yeah.
How did you feel being part of this universe, trying to uncover it and being enveloped in it?
I think the one word that that enabled me through this journey was to be non-judgmental. And so what I was doing was just exploring all his different facets, his paradoxes, allowing them to just kind of tell themselves and play themselves out, and really leave it to the reader to decide whether he loved this part of him or hated that part of him, or was absolutely accepting of the whole. But I had to lay it all out, and actually, according to me, every individual has these many sides. I think they just get more amplified when it comes to an artist or a well-known artist like this, because it's much more out there. But actually, it's a fact of life, and the human condition is such. And I think that when he talked about he was quite honest about his own pain and sorrows, and actually converted them into beauty. So in a way, it was very, very special that he had all these different sides to him. And of course, I think there was a lot of hurt in him, and with both inflicted by him and perhaps on him. And that's very evident in the story. So I think that I just had to tell the story, really. I mean, I wasn't trying to judge it or be moral about it, because it's like, who am I to do that, right?
Yeah, so maybe we should bring the listeners through a kind of cursory bio so they kind of understand what made him who he was. So he came from a long lineage of...
Yes, sitar and surbahar players. Very illustrious family. So his grandfather and his father had already become really well regarded in India. And so he was born into this incredible lineage. But then, there's always these twists of destiny where he lost his father at a very young age. And so, in a funny way, that took away his biggest mentor, but it also enabled him to kind of recreate his version of the music, which is what he did. Because he went and learned from his mother's side of the family, who were singers. They were hereditary singers and not sitar players. So he actually learned how to sing. And he became a very accomplished vocalist for several years. He was only doing that, largely doing that. In fact, if you hear his vocal, renditions, they're stunning. So he then basically transposed that kind of rendition, which is, vocal music, into an instrument and created the Gaikiyang, which is really the first of its kind in instrumental music, at least in sitar music. So he ended up sort of elevating sitar music to a higher level, because there was a hierarchy in those days, and vocal music was considered more sort of superior to instrumental music. So he actually sort of like just jostled everything around. And so it's very interesting, right? Like, you think that some tragedy, apocalyptic thing that happened in his life was the worst and most devastating thing, but it actually led him into another direction. And who knows what would have happened to his music if his father had been alive,
Right. And I wonder, like, is there a particular piece of music where you feel that this singing quality that he brought, is there one that you could put your finger on where you say, oh, this, when you say he made the sitar sing, maybe it's everything, but maybe something's going to jump to your...
Well, I think the pieces that would come to mind immediately are his Darbari Kannada and also his Sanj Saravali, which is just so sort of like melodious and beautiful. I mean, it really is sung in that, played in that khayal style of singing. So I think those are the two that come to mind.
All right, so let's take a listen. back to that period that you talk about, and just of when his father Inayat was not only extremely successful musically, but also people were throwing their pearls at him, and he was extremely rich, and he was somewhat of a playboy himself as well. He was a partier kind of.
I just don't know enough about that. But I assume based on, little bits of information that they all pretty much were.
Okay.
It wasn't even Playboy with the version that we think of as Playboy, right? It was just like that was part of their world. And so they used to hang out a lot with the Bais. So the music world and the sort of Tawaif world, which is the world of the dancing girls and singers, was all very interconnected, and so these lines that we have kind of created just didn't exist back then. But I just feel a little bit hesitant to comment on that.
Yeah, okay, so we don't really know. But either way, the more important thing for his bio is that he was raised with wealth for a short period. That he was raised around wealth. He was raised with high expectations. He was probably everybody who entered their home was obsequious not only to his father but to maybe him as the son of the great guru.
Absolutely, and you can tell just from like the photographs that I found. There's an extraordinarily beautiful picture of his parents when. He must have been a very little boy, and you can tell from the way they're dressed, they look really regal. The father had these sort of long curling locks that would come down, cascading down his, the side of his neck, and the mother is wearing these like anklets that are about 6 inches in width. They're just beautiful, and she looks beautiful, and they both look like they were extremely sort of posh people. And then, yes, he lost everything. His mother was a widow at a very young age, and he actually, one might want to suggest that combination of deprivation and ambition is also what sort of fueled his, his rigor and his practicing techniques, and not techniques, but the rigor with which he practiced, because he knew he had to make it on his own.
Well, if I remember correctly in the book, his mother actually kind of told him I'm not sure what age was it, 12 or younger.
So none of these numbers
are... we don't know.
Yeah, but we don't know because they
when
all...
He was, yeah.
But when he was very young.
Yeah, at a very young age, basically said, all the fair weather friends had disappeared. Yeah. With the father's death, they no longer had an income, and the father was not, putting this stuff in mutual funds. So,
right.
So... She actually told this young child who just lost his father that he's going to be the new breadwinner.
Absolutely.
And he has to be...
So she basically groomed him, I'm sure with that in mind as well, because she could see that, he was the potential breadwinner in the family. So she did something very interesting. She was quite the tiger mom. And so she basically divided the family assets with the assets were musical assets. They were and so she divided them between the two brothers. So the elder brother Vilayat learned the sitar, and the younger brother was going to be the surbahar player, and between the two of them they would carry the family legacy. And then she saw to it that in whatever way she could, she enabled his training by going to her maternal family, by going to random relatives and other associates of her husband's and in-laws, to just make sure that the training continued. Imrat Khan told me this amazing story about how she would get this one relative who had a bad substance abuse habit but had the music, and she would actually kind of like feed his habit just so that he would sit there and play and teach her younger son. So that's just kind of amazing. The lengths that she went, and really if it wasn't for her, we don't know what would have happened, because there's so many musical families where things just dissipate, like it's like one generation later and it's all over, because there's really no kind of formal setup for all this. It's just about getting it together.
Yeah, and I guess in their family, females' roles were not to be public performers.
Right.
So if they were musically gifted, their energies went towards grooming grooming the males.
Yeah, I mean, I believe so. I think that was very much the case in those days. I think it must have changed now, obviously, but yes, certainly. So she was really the sort of the back-end person who may have known the music, and so she could really train and engage with them while they were learning, but no, they would not perform.
But so essentially to you, was this the major kind of traumatic event that could kind of explain both, his drive and his and also his lack of patience for anything standing in his way and all this other stuff? Is this the kind of big formative thing to go from wealth to poverty?
That's a speculation, but I do believe from my little reading of psychology that what happens in your teenage years with wealth and deprivation do impact the way you engage with wealth even when you have it later. So it becomes a sort of a space in your head, and I think he really did go through a lot of humiliation and a lot of difficulties from the stories that he told his family and that I got to hear. So I'm sure that impacted him, yes.
And then in his teen years, he runs away.
Yeah, the runaway story is, I think, kind of uniformly told by every musician in India. So it's like, we don't know how much there was of running away or what it was. But yeah, he ran away. It's very dramatic. He went to Delhi. He found himself on the doorstep of All India Radio, which had just started. So that's an incredible backdrop because it was the first institution that was employing Indian classical musicians, and it became like a kind of a hub. So it's actually a big part of his whole development in those years, because the director of All India Radio, who then moved to Lahore after partition, was very instrumental in ensuring that he got access to these musicians, that he got, that he was given food and a roof over his head, and he sort of employed him in some small way over there. So it's really beautiful because you also get to sort of understand what that time was, where patronage had just shifted from the Maharajas, the kings, and the feudal lords, and to the first government institution. And then, of course, after a while, Vilayat Khan discarded it because he did not approve of certain grading systems that All India Radio had incorporated from the British, where government officers would be authorized to decide what grade an artist was. He found that really offensive. So he just, from 1952 onwards, did not play on the radio.
He burned a bridge.
He burned that bridge, among many others.
Yeah.
But that was one of the first. And so this whole time is a very interesting time because I also sort of attempted to understand the backdrop of what was happening. For example, it was also the time when gramophone records, etc., were coming out, and had been out for about 2 decades by then. And he made those his mentors as well. So he would actually listen endlessly to the recordings of the great musicians like Fayaz Khan and Abdul Karim Khan and Zohra Bai and later Kesar Bai. These are all like amazing musicians. And, he would almost memorize the music, which would then sort of find its way into his, but obviously with his own touch. But this is a very beautiful thing because this is how, Indian classical music is never really owned in a sense. It's just like a kind of a flow that happens, and one day somebody's the guru, and then there's another a shishya, and then the next thing the shishya has become the guru, and it's just kind of passed on in this beautiful way. And so I think that he really relied on every resource and available music to kind of create his own, and there's no notion of plagiarism or anything, but
And also, I guess one thing I started to glean from your book and other things lately is that the historical period that as India entered independence, the idea of having a national music when you have a country as big as India with all these different languages and cultures, that this was being pushed.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So All India Radio was kind of the first time that India had a national voice which would be uniform whether you were in the north, south, west or east, which until then was completely like, a singer from Mysore may never have heard a singer from Kashmir ever, because there was no technology to enable that. So suddenly there was a new uniform voice. There was an Indian Standard Time created, and they started sort of creating these national programs of Indian classical music, which then became a way of almost making you proud of your culture. So it became a kind of a narrative, a new narrative for India. And so all these artists were employed by radio, and it was a very, very exciting time in a sense for India, for these musicians. Then, of course, I think a lot of them moved into the film industry, which was more well-paying and also more glamorous. So many of these artists actually had two names. They would have what is it called?
Alias.
Like an alias name for their classical music, which they did on radio and in concerts, and then another name which they used when they were in the film industry doing compositions, which was slightly looked down upon, and so they didn't want to sort of expose themselves necessarily.
Right. Yeah, and I kind of think about that period too, that because of India's new identity, the music was extremely relevant, right? That was and maybe that's something hard to understand, that the excitement that this music had as a national music.
Yeah, but it was a little complicated, because a lot of these artists would find it very difficult and offensive to have to play within a slot, a time slot, and so they were so used to this kind of lavish, all-night concert where they would build up, take 2 hours to just warm up and then sort of play, and there'd be this, really languid energy to that. So in radio, they had to sort of like truncate their performances and work within that. So there was a lot of like jostling around, of mental space, and then it all worked out because they knew they didn't have a choice, right? And that's a very interesting time as well, because it's also the first time that Indian classical music traveled to the West. So there was huge changes happening, and that had its own impact, because suddenly you had Ravi Shankar playing with the Beatles and Yehudi Menuhin, and, Indian music was discovered.
Right.
Of course, that doesn't apply to Vilayat Khan, because he didn't go there until much later. But, so that there were very interesting sort of larger, broad sweep things going on in the background of Vilayat Khan's life. Which
right. And a cultural diplomat, he was not.
He was not. And I think he did spend a lot of time in the UK and in Europe in the 50s. But I think he also spent a lot of time in Iran and Afghanistan. So my sense is that if one were to compare him and Ravi Shankar was always much more of the international player. He had been abroad from the time he was a young teenager with his brother, and so that whole, he was more able to sort of like communicate with Western audiences. Sure. I think Vilayat Khan was a more traditional artist, and very consciously so.
I guess this kind of leads us to that famous story, of which there are many versions, but you begin with the book with this incident of a planned concert with Ali Akbar Khan and Ravi Shankar, and I guess I can let the storyteller take it from here.
Yeah, so it's an incredible story. Every journalist and storyteller is looking for that perfect anecdote to start their storytelling with, and this really just was amazing, because it was a iconic concert that took place in 1952 in New Delhi, and basically these three artists and two very well-known tabla players were all on stage together, And the story is that Vilayat Khan, it sort of turned into a battle of sitars where the notes became like arrows, that were being shot to annihilate. And eventually, I think Vilayat Khan was sort of, named the winner. And it became quite the talking point because everyone was there. It was like this concert.
Right. And
everyone
I actually
remembers.
heard a version recently from Ishan Ghosh, who is Nayan Ghosh's
Oh, yeah.
son. And Nayan Ghosh got the story from Ravi Shankar. And in that version, it was, one thing that was agreed upon in all the versions was that after he was the victor of this, that he didn't win gracefully. He kind of, that there was a kind of agreement that he held up the sitar, kind of like a machine gun, and
yeah.
kind of said,
So I've heard that
who's
too.
Next?
I've heard that too.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it sounds plausible because I think he was an angry young man. He was 24 at the time, and there was a kind of a very strong, aggressive energy in him. He mellowed out much later. And so, the different versions of the story are not as relevant as the sort of bottom line, which was to place these two sitar players on the same stage and present, who Vilayat Khan was, which is why that chapter is called "Who is this Vilayat Khan?"
Right.
For somebody who hasn't necessarily heard of, him and doesn't know that world. And I think another sort of subtext to this book is also that, fame and talent often have very little to do with each other. I've seen that in my sort of over the years in my journey in the world of music. And so I think Vilayat Khan seems to have not been as interested in fame, and he chose not to be a collaborative artist, even though he had choices. He did, he sort of turned down major awards because he didn't believe that any random official had the right to arbitrate or be the arbiter of who is a better musician.
Right.
He, at the height of his career in his mid-30s, he moved to the hills of Shimla, which was in the middle of nowhere, because he felt like. And so I think that his, trajectory has always been a kind of a narrative of resistance, in a sense. And it's very beautiful, actually, to come across this and still see the depth of his music, and sort of understand that he was really, not to say that other artists weren't, but he certainly was playing his music with incredible integrity, without this sort of worldly motivation of being recognized. Having said that, it would irk him that he wasn't. Every once in a while he would talk about, he would rant about this. But he still stuck to his guns. And I find that very beautiful and inspiring, actually, as a creative person, to be able to have that inner, you're sort of working just with yourself and your art.
Right. I mean, I guess even when, there's moments late in life that you capture where he was practicing and someone wanted to watch him practice, and he faced the wall practicing.
Beautiful story.
Yeah.
I heard that from a friend who was his student, and she said that she asked if she could come into the room while he was practicing. This is when he was much older, living in Princeton. And he said, "No, sweetheart, for then it would not be practice, it would be performance."
Right. So are there recordings of this young period where he's playing like someone who has something to prove that you can think of off the top of your head? Something fiery?
There are some. There are short.
There
are those Megaphone Company recordings, which then eventually got bought by HMV, which is now Saregama. So they are accessible.
Mm-hmm. Is there something you'd recommend we take a listen to now?
There is a little piece in Tori, I believe.
Okay, we'll check it out. Okay, so Vilayat Khan is a young man. He is starting to become recognized and successful. And what are the ways that he's kind of letting the world know that this is the case?
So I think you can see the trajectory of his music and his, he used to really play with an idea to impress, with the sort of the energy of, it was more energetic than mellow. Mm-hmm. And so you see that the incredible technique and his sheer perfection, you see all that, but what you don't see until much later is that desire not to impress. It's kind of incredible because you can hear the ease in his music. It's when, the notes have just kind of like entered his muscles and his nerves, and he's kind of like just playing because he just is playing, and he has that sort of ease that you hear in somebody's music is something really special. There's a word which in Hindi is tehrav. It's very hard to translate it, but it basically is a kind of a very easy and quiet space, even in the music.
It's funny, someone explained that term to me last night, because we were doing a close listening to Hari Prasad Chaurasia, and that tehrav, as you speak of, is ever present in his music. It's unhurried.
Right, it's unhurried.
Comfortable in the space that it is.
I mean, there were, in the old days, musicians would not allow their children and their students to perform until they were much older, because a lot of what comes into your playing only comes much later. It comes with the practice and with life. And so it's you're sort of like killing the golden goose by putting them on stage at a young age, even if they're really competent.
So at this time, he's a young man. He's dressing as dapper as he can possibly dress.
Yeah, he used to sometimes cut and stitch his own clothes and drive his family crazy.
And he would.
He would not just dress himself, but if his family was attending a concert, he'd actually curate what they were going to wear because they were part of his, persona.
Right.
So nothing for him was just like accidental and spontaneous. When it came to performance, it was so meticulous and thought out. He had such regard for his audience that it had to be just perfect. And he thought it through. He would even practice the way he would walk onto stage. how he would take his bow, at which point he would stop a particular rag and start the other.
I feel that being around, it's this kind of jumping forward in his life, but that kind of controlling persona is really wonderful in an artist, and probably much more complicated as a father or a husband.
Of course. So I think that each member of his family, in their own way, suffered. And but I think that they all got both sides of the coin, because when you're around somebody like this, you get these nuggets of wisdom and musical wisdom that are just so precious. But then perhaps as, when it comes to family, it can get difficult. I mean, he was traveling a lot. He was possibly very self-absorbed, very moody. One of his family members said that if you so much as whistled at him, he'd pull out a gun. So he had a certain sort of ruthlessness, clearly. And I think it did play out. But I mean, that's just one of those spaces which I think people learn to navigate or not.
Mm. And so, I mean, I think it's important to talk about this period, because this young period or mid period, because people might project onto Indian classical musicians maybe a Spartan way of life, or something,
Spartan, none of them were.
Yes, exactly. This guy was basically a playboy. I mean, he was partying every night.
For a period. I mean, that was up, until a certain point. And then he just, I think, moved to the hills, so there wasn't as much scope. He would hang out there with his roosters and dogs more than people.
Right.
But, Spartan is not a word that I would use to describe pretty much any of them. Mm-hmm. However, I think there were moments of great stoic Spartan existence within that, which possibly is what led them to become such great musicians. So I think that they weren't unidimensional. I think that they just played life out in all its different rags, so to speak. I mean, one of my favorite stories is about Hari Prasad, since you brought him up, and Hari Prasad ji and Vilayat Khan, who were buddies. And there's a time when Hari Prasad was in giving a concert in New Jersey, and Vilayat Khan found out that his friend was there. So he sent his younger son Hidayat to get him home with a message that he was cooking his favorite partridge curry that night. And when Hari Prasad found out that this was, what was on offer, he actually stopped playing earlier and ran out of the green room and just jumped into the car and was like, let's go. So he kind of feigned illness, and he was just, so they were really funny. I mean, they were just like...
Yeah, and food was huge. Food and aesthetics in general.
Yeah, so I think he had this view that your sensory life was very interconnected and all played into your music in some ways. So I think he treated taste with a certain refinement, which was also the way he viewed his music. So for him, he's talked about how even the point at which you put salt into your food affects the way in which the food tastes. And your music has to be so subtle that level of detail has to come into not just the way you cook, but the way you play. And so I think he really believed that you have to sort of refine your aesthetic to such a level. He gives this beautiful story about how even if the listener is not able to sort of get that that subtle refinement that you've worked on, their subconscious mind will get it, and it will impact them. I think that's just very stunning, because it's at a level of nuance that is very hard to even explain to a generation that is so used to instant gratification and playing to the gallery.
Sure.
So for me, these were very important moments. And I think and I hope that I have actually changed the way I view life and my creative process, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's part of the river of inspiration, right? Touching, getting involved with these great artists. And
Yeah, I mean, it's just really a privilege because you don't get these messages. For me, some of the biggest compliments I've gotten from this after this book have come from musicians who've written to me and said that they have been inspired to practice harder after reading it. To me, that's like, wow, we created a little more music in the world. Like, that's great. And that's how it's supposed to be, right? Like, everything has this little ripple effect. And, if you can somehow participate in that whole process of flow. I mean, sometimes when you look at even the way, Ravi Shankar was responsible for a certain moment in American history, which then led to a connoisseur of music who then 20 years later became obsessed with Vilayat Khan. It's all very connected and beautiful. So nothing is random. And, I find all these kind of, connecting the dots very, very beautiful and interesting.
Yeah, and I suppose, the biographical stuff, the gossipy element of it, or the that's not the heart of it. At the heart of it is an artist and the art, and maybe something even past all of that.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I definitely made that attempt, and the gossipy stuff was really about storytelling to, just keep a person engaged, because how are you going to talk about, sort of the vision of music without a little bit of fun as well and a little bit of story?
Sure.
But the larger part of it was really about the vision that he had for music and for living, and also that these are things that are sort of like so much larger than us, I was really like very moved by that period when India was discovering, Western music and jazz, and America was and the UK and basically the West was discovering Indian music, and it was as if there was this beautiful kind of invisible cultural exchange taking place, and the impact that all had on everyone is really kind of remarkable. It's then set new tributaries out.
Right. Yeah, and I found it very moving, that passage where, as you said earlier, he, as a young boy, he learned everything he could, or as a teenager, everything he could from records, and that he kept that alive with his grandchildren, and he would force everybody to listen to records over
with
and
his
over
children,
again.
with his children.
And
he was listening to like
Ella
jazz
Fitzgerald
and
right.
Betta Bartok and Janis Joplin, and really finding each person's amazing quality and suggesting that quality be brought into their music.
Right.
That is also an act of great humility, because it's acknowledging the best in another artist, even if that artist is a young folk singer, which is what he did. He went and found this young folk singer, and for that moment made that singer into his teacher and sat on the ground while that young boy, in his absolute baffled way, was made to sit on a couch and teach him. I mean, that really, it's an incredible act of humility, and that ability to be a student when you need to be a student, I think kept his whole creativity alive right till his last day.
Right, and his creativity and interest and experimentation, they went beyond music to his tinkering with his cars. He could could change the height of his car, that kind of thing.
I mean, really, he was obsessed with his car, and he could I think he had such a profound relationship with sound that he could tell what was wrong with the car by the hum of the engine. He had such an intimate relationship with and he also was passionate about doing whatever he was doing. He would sort of play around and do a lot of DIY things in the house. Mm-hmm. He would also engage with people, I'm told, at a very personal and intimate level, where he would actually ask them about their lives and want to know. So this ability to engage, I think, with anything and any, element of life is very powerful, right? Because it keeps you alive.
And it seemed like towards the end of his life, he seemed to enjoy the greater anonymity of moving to, I think it was New Jersey and Princeton, and not being at all times surrounded by people wah-wah-wahing at every single thing he
says
said.
that in an interview, and I think he enjoyed just being, a quote-unquote regular guy. He used to play a lot of cards. He used to hang out with these people, and he would still play his music and teach and come back to India every year. But it seems like he had gotten a bit tired of the politics in music in India, and I think was looking for a really salubrious environment which Princeton, New Jersey offered him.
I'd like to listen to that famous recording that you speak of with Imrat Khan, his brother on Surbahar.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah, you want to
The
set
Night
that
at the Taj.
Yeah.
So it's basically a duet that these two brothers played, and it's considered one of the most stunning instrumental duets of all time in India. And it's what's beautiful about it is Vilayat Khan really unleashed his fertile imagination and created a kind of not a libretto, but a story, a narrative behind the piece. So the entire piece is actually based on his story of these two lovers who come down, their souls come down for one night and dance around the Taj, and they are basically the King Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal for his wife Mumtaz. And so he shows her what he's built for her for the first time in this musical piece. And in it, the Surbahar, which is a kind of a more bass sitar, it's like the cello to the violin, is the voice of Shah Jahan, played by Imrat Khan, the younger brother. And the sitar is the voice of Mumtaz, and it's played by Vilayat Khan. And it's really beautiful. So they're sort of like dancing around, and then at the very end, there's a very sort of a sad, plaintive few minutes. And this is the point at which the fairies have come down to remind them that the night is over and the party is over, and they have to go back up because they're not human. And it's really sweet. It's corny, but it's really beautiful. And for him to sort of create this beautiful, dramatic narrative of music and play it, and when you actually hear it in the music, it's quite amazing. So, yeah.
Yeah, let's take a listen. That might be a nice way to take it out. So the thing that I was really fascinated to learn at the very end of the book, I mean, there's so many great stories that people will have to buy the book to read, such as getting his cobalt blue, what kind of car was it?
Oh, yeah, I believe it was a cobalt blue Mercedes.
And driving it all the way from Iran. They'll have to read the book.
It's
for
incredible.
That.
And then having
amazing.
a party for it. He named the car Ghazala and dressed it up as his bride by putting a big nose ring on the bonnet, and then had this epic party for it.
Right, and you stumble. We're in the presence of the invitation, which
Yep.
is an amazing document of a. This. You can see that it was a wild party just from the invitation, which kind of shows what a heady, exciting time that was.
Sure. And also the kind of people he was hanging around at that time, and Bombay at that time. So it gives you a whole kind of a picture of, what life was like.
So I found it so interesting to learn that, I'll step back and say that this book, it seems like a very kind of balanced and intimate portrait of somebody with the good and the bad and all mixed in. And I can imagine that's a very delicate balance. And it was very interesting to read that you wrote this at the behest of his son Hidayat.
Yeah, because I think his son felt that nobody really knew the man. They knew the musician and they knew the music, but, he wanted the man to come out. The man had so many extraordinary facets.
Right, and you had the participation of his other son.
Yeah, it was very generous of him to share stories and be quite open, even though there was an estrangement between them. But Shujat was very open and generous,
right,
I have
and
to
his brother.
say.
So the family was part of this.
Yeah, I think so. I was terrified and when I went to meet his brother, who lived in St. Louis, Missouri, strangely, which is the most unlikely place for a Indian classical Surbahar player to end up. But there he was, and he was so sweet and kind and warm, and opened his stories up to me and spoke about their fight and their and the pain and the love and everything.
And so have you gotten any response? Have they read the book yet?
Imrat Khan passed away soon after,
right?
Which is why I feel even more privileged to have been there. Yes, Shujat was really sweet and sent me a very kind message saying that the book made him laugh and cry. And to me that was, as good as it gets when you hear that from somebody about his father. And then Hidayat, of course, has been just overjoyed and participated in the whole process with me and the, launches. And it's been beautiful because it's something where I think he's joyful for his reasons and I am excited about the book. And so it's been really special. I feel like I'm almost, part of the family now. And in my own way, I've sort of like posthumously tried to bring them all together in the book. If you notice in the last chapter, it was just my little tribute to this great... It's the first family of sitar in the world, I mean, really. Between the brothers and the sons and the uncles and the cousins, they covered the whole incredible, the best sitar players today are from this family.
Right.
So while they may not talk to each other or whatever for their own reasons, the fact is that they're all from this one incredible gene pool.
Right.
So
yeah,
for me, that's like
you
really
have
something.
Nishat Khan and you have Shahid Parvez.
Exactly.
Shujat.
Really.
So
So I think that it's really important to acknowledge that and give them a lot of, just pay a tribute.
Yeah, I think they deserve a lot of credit for allowing their story to be so open, and I would think that it would contribute to the healing of some of the struggles that have that come with such a heavy burden and such
I
a
hope
troubled
so.
history.
I hope so. That's a whole other journey.
Yeah. Well. Anyway, thank you for your time. This was lovely, and
Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to checking out the music room, which I've heard much about. And listeners should know that this is going to come out as an audiobook.
Yes.
And include samples of his work, which is...
thanks to Lyle Wachowski.
Right.
Who recorded some of the best ever pieces of Vilayat Khan in New York.
Yeah, and that's... Yeah. Well, that's for the next interview.
Yeah.
That's a whole other many fascinating things, but how that all happened
and how Bloomingdale's was responsible for getting him to the U.S. I find that so incredibly funny.
Yeah, although maybe that's not as ironic as we think.
We're all mere commodities out there for consumption.
Well, all right. So thank you, Namita Devidayal. This was lovely. And
thank you so
we'll look
much.
forward to your future books.